The metal chair creaked beneath me as I shifted, trying not to bump the mop bucket pressed against my leg. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile, blue-white hue across the cement floor of the supply room. It smelled like pine disinfectant and mold. I had flown across the country for this meeting, one they insisted was invite only for stakeholders, only to be dumped here like a forgotten janitor. Through the thin partition wall, I heard the others mingling in the conference room, laughter, the pop of champagne corks, and my cousin Yared's smug voice booming above the rest. Some big-time investors flying in today, he bragged. Guy thinks we're his golden goose. We just have to act sharp for an hour. Then we'll bleed him slowly. The others chuckled. Another voice chimed in, his younger brother Dylan, always the echo. No way he'll catch on. It's just business. My hands stayed folded in my lap. Calm. Silent. Listening. Because the man they were talking about, the investor with the $1 million promise, was sitting 10 feet away behind a plywood wall, in a folding chair, in the storage room they didn't think twice about using as a dumping ground. They hadn't recognized me when I walked in. Not surprising, it had been over 15 years. I wore a cheap jacket on purpose, gave a fake name, said I was just observing on behalf of a partner. They didn't ask questions, just pointed me to the back. They thought I was no one. They thought wrong. And the moment they realized who I really was, who had been sitting quietly behind that wall, taking note of every word, would be the moment their entire empire began to unravel. I wasn't always the outsider. There was a time, before my father died, when I used to sit at that same boardroom table, legs too short to touch the floor, swinging underneath while my dad and Uncle Leo talked strategy over coffee. The family business was everything back then. They built it together from the ground up, 2 brothers and a dream. Logistics, trucking, warehousing, it wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. But when my father passed in a car accident, everything changed. Uncle Leo offered my mom some help, then quietly pressured her to sign over my father's shares for a token amount. It's best for the company, he had said. We'll take care of the boy. He didn't. They didn't. Within months, we were out of the company, out of the house, and out of town. Mom never fought it. She said family meant more than money, but I saw what it did to her, how she shrank in silence whenever her name came up in family gossip, how she clipped coupons and took night shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on, and how, at Christmas, we never received a single card from them again. Years passed. I worked, learned, built. And when word got around that Leo's sons were drowning in debt, I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction. Just a calm, cold sense of inevitability. It was their turn to sit in the dark. I reached out under a pseudonym. Said I represented a private equity firm interested in logistics investments. They were ecstatic. Desperate, even. I knew they wouldn't recognize me. After all, to them, I had never really existed. Just the kid from the second wife, as Jared once called me when he didn't know I was listening. And still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. But when I showed up at their office for the big investor meeting, dressed modestly, they took one look at me, no Armani suit, no entourage, and pointed at the back door. Oh, you're with the assistant firm, Jared said without even glancing up from his phone. We've got a supply room for support staff. Grab a chair in there. We'll call you if we need coffee. No one laughed. Because no one thought it was strange, not even for a second. And I realized, in that moment, they hadn't just forgotten me. They never saw me to begin with. The thing about being overlooked your whole life is, it teaches you how to move silently and strike precisely. After that day in the storage room, I didn't lash out. I didn't reveal myself or demand respect. That would have been satisfying for a moment, but short-sighted. I knew better. I had spent the last 15 years becoming a man they couldn't afford to ignore even if they had. After my mother passed, I buried her in the same town they cast us out of. Quietly. No calls were made to the family. No invitation sent. I stood there alone at her gravesite, and made a silent promise, one day, they'll say your name with reverence, or not at all. I started from nothing. First, as a truck dispatcher pulling double shifts. Then, logistics management. Slowly, I learned how freight moved, how vendors cheated margins, how to read people like spreadsheets. I saved every cent. Invested in failing warehouses others abandoned. Turned them profitable. Then built Crescent Horizon Investments, my own firm that specialized in identifying companies like theirs, bloated, arrogant, and on the edge of collapse. It had taken me nearly a decade to reach the level where my name made doors open and competitors sweat. But I always kept it hidden. That was my greatest weapon. No one saw me coming. By the time Jared and Dylan were hunting for a white knight to save their debt-ridden empire, Crescent Horizon had already quietly bought out 3 of their regional competitors. We'd undercut their contracts, poached their talent, and now they were asking for a lifeline from the very hand that had been tightening the rope. And they still didn't know it. Even as I sat behind that wall in the storage room, I wasn't angry, I was calm. Because they had just shown me exactly who they still were, entitled, smug, incurious. And I had become the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to burn a legacy to the ground. The moment I walked out of that office building, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The next phase had already begun. The cousins thought they were entertaining a potential investor. They didn't know they'd just invited in their executioner. That night, I had my legal team activate a sequence of acquisitions we'd quietly prepared months in advance. It wasn't a coincidence. I'd had my eyes on their company long before they knew they needed help. Now, I was making moves they wouldn't even see until it was too late. First, I purchased the debt their company owed to 3 minor creditors, at a discount, of course. Suddenly, I had a legal foothold and leverage to force early repayments. Next, I made direct offers to their top-performing regional managers, people the cousins ignored but who made the business run. With better salaries, flexible hours, and dignity, they jumped ship without hesitation. Then came the hammer. I acquired their biggest supplier's logistics center through a holding firm, and froze future shipments, citing breach of contract. Their deliveries stalled. Their clients started calling. Complaints flooded their inbox. Meanwhile, I released an anonymous industry white paper, picked up by a popular business blog, dissecting the fall of legacy-run logistics companies, using sanitized, but very specific details pulled straight from the cousins' financial proposal. It hit a nerve. Rumors started to spread. Potential investors backed away. Inside a month, their company wasn't bleeding, it was hemorrhaging. And the best part? They still didn't know who was behind it, but they were getting desperate. I knew it when my assistant forwarded me a frantic email from Yared's office. Can we please schedule a follow-up call with Crescent Horizon? Our partners are eager to continue discussions. I smiled. Let them come crawling. Because I had waited 15 years to be seen, and when I showed up again, it wouldn't be through the back door. When the email from Yared's assistant hit my inbox, laced with urgency and poorly concealed panic, I didn't reply. Not immediately. I waited 3 days. Then I sent a single-line response through my firm's public-facing account. We are willing to consider a final meeting to discuss a full acquisition, terms to be determined. No signatures. No names. Just power. They responded within 10 minutes, begging for a time and location. I chose their office. I wanted them to sit in the chairs they once ruled from, feeling smaller with every breath. I wanted them to choke on their own pride, but more than that, I wanted clarity. I wasn't doing this for revenge alone. I was buying back the name they disgraced, brick by brick. If there was anything left of my uncle's original legacy, before greed and arrogance drowned it, I'd preserve that. Everything else. Dust. In the days leading up to the meeting, I had my team prepare the final blow, a full financial audit conducted via a private firm we controlled, showing how mismanaged the company was. Inflated invoices, phantom expenses, crony contracts. If they resisted, we'd leak it. If they cooperated, we'd bury it. I walked into the office alone on the morning of the meeting. No fanfare. No entourage. Jared and Dylan were already seated, sweating, fidgeting, trying to look composed in cheap suits that once screamed confidence. They stood when I entered, blinking in disbelief. "You." Jared finally croaked. I took the head seat at the table. "I believe we have business to discuss," I said calmly. "You, what is this?" Dylan blurted. "You're the investor." I didn't answer. I opened the folder in front of me and slid it across the table. Inside was an acquisition agreement, one that left them with just enough dignity to say they sold instead of surrendered. "This is extortion," Jared snapped, voice cracking. "No," I replied. "This is the cost of underestimating people. Something you've made a career of." They stared at the pages, speechless. All the control they'd once wielded, all the rooms they kept me out of, all the names they forgot, including mine, were now sitting like a weight on their chest. And then I leaned forward, voice low but razor sharp. "My name is Daniel Chen. Son of William Chen. Nephew of Leo. The same William you pushed out. The same one you pretend never existed." I watched the color drain from their faces. There it was. Recognition. And fear. The silence after I said my father's name was like a thunderclap in a vacuum. Jared's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Dylan stared at the folder like it was written in fire. I thought your mother moved overseas," Jared finally stammered. "She did," I said coolly. "After you and your father bled her dry and told her she didn't belong. After you forced her to sign over the shares my father built with his bare hands." I let the words hang there, heavy as judgment. This company was once honorable. It stood for something. But now, you treat employees like errand boys, siphon funds like gamblers, and can't even recognize the man who came here to save what little worth is left. Dylan stood up, fists clenched. "You think you're better than us?" "No," I said, rising slowly to meet his eye. "I know I am. Because I didn't take what I have, I earned every inch of it while you two were busy treating legacies like poker chips." I tossed another file onto the table. A forensic audit, complete with photographs, vendor names, timestamps. Every under-the-table deal. Every bloated transaction. Every lie. "Don't sign the offer, and this goes public by morning," I said. "You'll be out of business and on trial. Sign it, and you'll walk away quietly. Still humiliated, but not indicted." Jared collapsed back into his chair. He finally understood. The cousin they once laughed at had become the man holding their entire world by the throat, and doing it legally. He picked up the pen with trembling hands. "You've waited a long time for this, haven't you?" I looked at him. "No. I waited a long time for justice. This is just overdue bookkeeping." They signed. And with that, everything changed. 2 months later, the company relaunched under its new name, Chen Horizon Logistics. I didn't choose the name out of ego. I chose it to restore something. For the first time since my father's name was erased from the records, it was back, above the entrance, on every invoice, engraved in steel above the main headquarters. A name no longer buried in silence, but built into legacy. I invited every employee to the relaunch gala, drivers, dispatchers, technicians. People who had been ignored, underpaid, and disrespected. They walked into the ballroom in second-hand suits, not expecting much. But when I stood on stage and shared the full story of who I was, what the company meant to my family, and how their quiet perseverance inspired the rebuild, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. No jargon. No stockholder fluff. Just truth. Applause thundered. And then, a surprise. I stepped aside and revealed a commemorative plaque in honor of William Chen, co-founder, father, visionary. My mother's favorite photo of him, sleeves rolled, smiling beside his delivery truck, was framed above it. And in the front row, sat Mrs. Liao, the warehouse supervisor, who trained me on my first job, when I was just 18. She smiled with pride. Jared and Dylan. Gone. Word spread that they'd tried to start a side venture. No one would work with them. Too toxic. Too arrogant. In the end, they faded the way they lived, loud, fast, and empty. But I built something lasting. And as I stood outside that night, looking up at the building with my father's name glowing quietly against the skyline, I felt it for the first time. Not revenge. Not triumph. Peace. Because when they seated me in the storage room, they thought I was nothing. But now, they're not even in the building.